When someone demands you hand over your lunch money or something else, you've pretty much got two options. You can hand it or part of it over in an act of appeasement, hoping the bully will leave you alone after that, or you can stand your ground and say no way. Both options have consequences. In the political world, nations make that same choice when in conflict with one another.
Hey there. This is an M4 Sherman tank. Nobody's stealing your lunch money if you've got one of these. It was the primary tank for the Allied forces during World War II, a war which illustrates how appeasing a bully can fail.
When looking back on World War II today, we all know that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were dangerous. We've learned about the sovereign nations they invaded and the atrocities they committed.
But in the years leading up to the war, the situation wasn't so clear. As the Nazi Party grew in strength and Adolf Hitler became more powerful, the rest of Europe struggled with the question of how to respond. Should the Nazi Party's demands be met with a firm military response? Or should the Allies try to avoid conflict by appeasing Hitler instead? Meanwhile, America did not want to get involved and remained silent about the whole thing.
In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany began to make increasingly aggressive territorial demands. First, Austria was annexed. And then, in 1938, Hitler turned his eye to the border regions of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. These areas were occupied by ethnic Germans, and Hitler demanded these territories to be given over to Germany. The Czechs refused to give their land away, and war seemed inevitable. Here, near the German border, Czechoslovakia built a system of fortifications which might have prevented World War II as we know it. Between 1936 and 1938, as German power grew, Czechoslovakia built over 200 heavy bunkers like this one, along with over 10,000 concrete machine gun nests. The Czechs were preparing to fight the Nazis before World War II even began.
After the Anschluss, which was Germany's takeover of Austria, Hitler didn't sit still for a moment. He started immediately to try to destabilize Czechoslovakia, a country he hated because it had been created by the Versailles Treaty. Czechoslovakia had a very large German minority in what was called the Sudetenland.
The German minority increasingly started radicalizing themselves during the 1930s. That was naturally a threat to the security and ability of Czechoslovakia to defend itself in the 1930s. It was also one of the reasons why the fortification of the border regions began at exactly that time.
This Czech bunker has been renovated and is near to its original condition. Back in the late 1930s, these fortifications were state-of-the-art. They were built to resist conventional artillery shells and protected from chemical attack by redundant air pumps and filters. The men inside were prepared to defend overlapping sections of the Czech-German border with armor-piercing artillery and anti-personnel weapons.
Behind the fortified line was to be a motorized army, highly motorized and well equipped with armored vehicles that should be able to liquidate any eventual breakthroughs through the fortified line. But it was assumed that the Czech defense would hold up until the first signs of assistance from the Allies.
Czechoslovakia's most powerful allies at the time were the French and the British. France had a mutual military assistance treaty with Czechoslovakia, but they did not want to face Germany without British help. And the British, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, wanted to avoid war at nearly all costs.
Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler to find a diplomatic solution. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland be handed over to Germany. Chamberlain, believing that Hitler's territorial claims would end there, decided to appease him. But what is appeasement?
Appeasement is a political strategy whereby one party makes concessions, like giving land or money or material to an adversary in order to avoid conflict. Seems like a peaceful solution, but do you think that it can backfire?
thing to remember about appeasement is it came into currency in the 1920s and 30s as a positive term. It was in the landscape of sober and judicious politicians, statesmen, and diplomats not repeating the errors of, say, World War I. And they felt that war was not necessarily innate to the human condition, and that balance of power, deterrence, alliances were archaic or ossified ideas. And if you showed goodwill to an aggressor, that magnanimity would be appreciated. It wouldn't be despised as proof of weakness. The problem with appeasement is that until the human condition changes, it's usually considered by aggressors as a sign of weakness to be exploited rather than reciprocity to be appreciated.
On September 30th, 1938, the French and British leaders met with Hitler in Munich, Germany, and signed what would be called the Munich Agreement. It granted the Nazis claims to Czech lands. The Czech people viewed this as a great betrayal, particularly since they weren't even invited to the negotiation table.
Americans in particular are extraordinarily critical of that choice, but in the context of a Britain that suffered catastrophic losses in World War I, a whole generation of Britain's young men swept away. That makes me actually a lot more sympathetic to his choice of trying to avoid in any way possible a war in which Britain had not yet been attacked, but its allies had been.
The Czech people were helpless without the support of their allies. They had little choice but to let the Nazis pass between the very bunkers built to deter them and keep them out of their homeland. Meanwhile, Neville Chamberlain returned to the United Kingdom a hero.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
The British people celebrated in the streets because it meant that there wasn't going to be a war. At least they didn't think there was going to be a war.
Within a year, the Nazis occupied the whole of Czechoslovakia. Winston Churchill, who would later become Prime Minister during World War II, warned that this and worse would happen in a speech on October 5, 1938, merely days after the agreement had been signed. Today, Churchill's speech is preserved at the Churchill Archives in Cambridge.
So this is going to be the 1938 Munich speech that Winston Churchill gave in the House of Commons. And here it is. Some wonderful stuff. Here he says, "I therefore begin by saying what is most unpopular and most unwelcome, what every one of us would like to ignore or forget, but what must nevertheless be stated, namely that we have sustained a total, unmitigated defeat." He also says, "There was never any danger of a fight if all the time one side meant to give away completely." That's one of the great obvious truths of appeasement. And this actually has the final moment where he is summing up, and he says, "This is only the first sip, first foretaste of the bitter cup which will be proffered to you unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigour we can arise again to stand for freedom as in the olden time."
For the immediate short term, appeasement's very effective. You just kick the can down the road and it gets, unfortunately, more serious each time you do that. Hitler had less material resources in the mid-1930s than the combined democracies on the European continent, but he felt that because they were so willing to appease him, there must be some reason why that was. And so he kind of concluded that the winners of World War I were more traumatized than the losers. And that gave him more encouragement to try something even grander and bolder each year.
One can't help but wonder what might have happened if nations like Britain and France had presented a more forceful response to the Nazis early in their rise. Would it have prevented the deadliest war in history? Or just delayed the inevitable?
The trouble with the Second World War parallels is that they're never exact, but the messages are the same. The messages that Winston Churchill came out with in the 1930s, which is that you only negotiate from strength, that you do not appease unless it is from a position of strength. I think these are just as true today as ever they were.
So, should threats and demands be appeased? Or does that only postpone some inevitable conflict? Should all threats be met with a firm military response? Or should diplomacy always be given a chance? What do you think?